Welcome to the latest episode of USC Trojans Primetime Live here on the USC channel at the Voice of College Football. Hope you had a great 4th of July weekend, everybody. Now we're back 1 week later. We welcome back Ethan Inman. Ethan, I hope you had a great 4th of July. And hey, USC with more fireworks on the recruiting trail. Booby Feaster, like that was another splash. And I think as I ask you for your opinion on this, you talked about Mark Bowman as, not just another tight end, right? Like this could be a generational player, could be really significant, not just in terms of meeting needs, but like we're talking special high-end talent. I'm getting the sense, like just so everyone knows here, before we come on the air, we discuss what we're going to talk about, how we're going to go about our business. All right. Like, we do kind of talk shop just so that we're kind of a little bit prepared here, right? Professionalism and all that. But we did not talk on the air specifically about Booby Feaster. We talked about that we were going to discuss him on the show, but we did not have an extended dialogue. Yet, Ethan, I get the sense you think he's another one of these generational players. And again, like some recruits just seem to create a much bigger splash than others. Booby Feaster seems to be in that category. Am I correct?
I think you are. Part of the reason why Booby Feaster is going to get a lot of attention is just because he has a very silly nickname. I mean, let's, address the elephant in the room. He's another guy named Ethan, and yet he chooses to go by Booby. So interesting choice there. But that's just kind of how they do it in Texas, I think. But so he's always going to get that extra amount of attention because of his nickname. I think, every time he's in a highlight, there's going to be people going off in the comments on social media like, is that really his name? Is that really his name? Like, it's never going to get old with the social media people, probably. But he's, it's not just name value. It's not just a guy who you can market well, who's, going to pair well with the USC market. He is a very good football player. He's a top 10 wide receiver in the nation. Depending on where you look, I've seen him as high as number 4, sometimes around number 7. Regardless, top 10 wide receiver in the nation. That's pretty undisputed. And he's 6'1", I think like around 180 pounds. So he has the size to play like any of the wide receiver positions. Very fluid guy. And just also, I always feel good about prospects from Texas just because of the way that they run Texas high school football. I mean, it's just such a big thing over there. You're used to playing in front of big fan bases. You're used to, it just being such a way of life down there, football kind of being in your blood, that kind of thing. So I think that's a good sign as well. Overall, it's just another big get, especially like you said, paired with Mark Bowman. That's kind of a thought that I had. You brought his name up. I was going to bring his name up as well. The more names you bring in, the more it benefits all of these individuals. I mean, Booby Feaster would be a great wide receiver regardless of where he played and regardless of, who's playing alongside him. But playing alongside Mark Bowman, that's going to open things up for him even more. And same with Mark Bowman having things open up with Booby Feaster, that kind of thing. So, you're just seeing now like it being some of these rooms get developed, and the wide receiver room is obviously one of the rooms that USC fans are most interested in, one of the most exciting position rooms on a football roster. So yeah, just really, really excited to see those developments. And, you're going to need a couple of receivers to replace what Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane bring too, I think. So all around, just everyone's excited. Cool that the news came on the 4th of July too. I saw that his graphic had some fireworks in it. I could probably pull it up for our viewers to see here. Because I always have it on hand. Here we go. Yeah, Hayes Fawcett did another incredible job there on that. But yeah, so it's all exciting. Everybody's excited. And he's, like I said, going to be super marketable too. The name value just speaks for itself for sure. I think you're muted, Matt. Sorry.
I think a natural follow-up question with Booby Feaster is, USC has Jaden Mayava, and then, next year there's an expectation that Husan Longstreet, will at least be in contention for QB1. And one of the discussion points that always comes up with quarterbacks and receivers, and that we saw this in a very clear way last year at USC, is that some quarterbacks just click with certain receivers. The relationship, the rapport is just more fluid. It works, and it doesn't work quite as much with others. And Miller Moss was just unwilling to trust his receivers. I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. I'm just calling it for what it is, as a fact, as a reality. Miller Moss did not trust his receivers to win 50-50 balls. Miller Moss was, thinking about, how do I make the percentage play, the percentage throw? But it got to a point where he just wasn't going to throw jump balls, let your receiver go up and get it. There are some times when you don't want to be throwing jump balls, where you have either your offense is humming, or like you're displaying physical superiority. You don't need to risk a certain throw. But there are other times when, you do need to trust your receiver to make a play. So it's case by case. But anyway, to underscore the point, Ethan, as you can sense, that the relationship USC receivers had with Jaden Maiava was very different from Miller Moss. So with Booby Feaster coming in, and you mentioned Mark Bowman as well, do you have any kind of early sense of, hey, they might fit Maiava in these ways, they might fit Hassan Longstreet in these ways? Any sense of how the pieces of the puzzle are going to fit in the 2026 USC passing game? What's your early sense? Obviously, it's a year in advance. And then, we're in this weird spot where USC's recruiting next year has us all looking ahead a year while we have 2025. But this is still the big story until summer camp gets going, or until Big Ten Media Days get going. This is still the big story around USC. So what's your early sense of how the 2026 passing game might come together in terms of the relationships between the USC quarterbacks and these incoming pass catchers?
Well, I think if, when you pitch Mark Bowman and you pitch Booby Feaster USC, you're ultimately pitching them Hassan Longstreet. So I'd assume that Lincoln Riley is kind of bridging, those relationships together, is really pointing towards Hassan Longstreet as like, hey, this is our guy in the future. Like, this is the guy you'll be spending the majority of your college career, partnering up with on the offensive side of the ball. So I would assume that is more of a fit that's being looked at than Maiava, just generally, because, even if Maiava stays another year, it's not like he's, you still have 2 more years of them playing with Hassan Longstreet as their quarterback. So, even in that kind of situation, you still, like I would, more heavily want to merge them with Hassan than with Jaden Maiava. But I do think, skills wise as well, Booby Feaster matches up well with Hassan Longstreet, just because he's more of a even more of an established dual threat quarterback. And I believe he's known to have a little bit of a bigger arm than Maiava, and Booby Feaster is kind of more of a traditional speedster. Mark Bowman I could see working well with Maiava, just because Maiava, at his best, takes some good risks and throws some of those 50-50 balls. And we talked about how big and strong Mark Bowman is and how good of a route runner he is, and, how he can, fight really some of those guys in the secondary for some of those 50-50 balls and that kind of thing. But I would think, when you're looking at Hassan Longstreet, you're looking at getting back to more of that traditional Lincoln Riley style offense that we saw with Caleb Williams, because you really want to really want to lean into his dual threat ability. And so, and that being, the pairing of him being a runner, but also having a really big arm, Maiava's shown both, but he's still raw. And I wouldn't say that he's, as good at either one as Caleb Williams was. So I think for me, that makes Booby Feaster and Hassan Longstreet a more natural match than him with Maiava. But Maiava is still dual threat, and we've seen him do things with both his arms and his legs. So if he's around, again, it could work. But I do think, regardless, like I said, you're pitching these receivers Hassan Longstreet, because that's who they're going to be with for the majority of their career here anyway.
As this USC roster takes shape for 2026, we've mostly been talking about the defensive side of the ball because you have an established, proven coordinator, Danton Lynn, and you have these excellent, highly regarded position coaches, Coach Henney, woof woof, dog work, Rob Ryan, Doug Belk. And so, like, most of the action, not all, but most, has been on the defensive side. And Jeff Rodriguez, one of the friends of the program, frequent viewer, he's regularly in the chat. He wanted my quick take on Booby last week. This was before the commitment was official. We recorded the show on Thursday, July 3rd. But he wanted to ask me, hey, assuming USC lands the commitment, which it did about 24 hours later, what do you think the importance of Booby Feaster would mean? And I told Jeff, most of the 2026 action's been on defense. Now you're getting another splash on offense. You're creating a more well-rounded roster. In any other additional insights, Ethan, in terms of how you think this 2026 roster is really taking shape? It's a year out, and these are just recruiting ratings that we have to wait a long time to see this potential become actualized. But from this early vantage point, what's your sense of how the full 2026 roster is really filling out, and how Booby Feaster fits into that picture?
I think you mentioned the defense. I think they've been pursuing a lot of big physical guys. I think, names like Luke Wafel and Keeney Pepe come to mind as, two of honestly the bigger commitments. Mark Bowman is probably the biggest prospect, but then those guys were like, Keeney Pepe was the headliner for a while. Luke Wafel was another really, really big name. And those are obviously massive, massive guys. Keeney Pepe is 6'7", 325. Luke Wafel's 6'5", 255. They're really building up the kind of size that you need in the Big Ten for sure. Tawanoa Ili is really big for a linebacker at 6'3", 210. There's just size all over this class. And that's not necessarily one of like Booby Feaster's like real standout traits. 6'1", 175, that's not, insane, but still, it's not like he's 5'9", and 125 pounds soaking wet or anything like that. Like, he's still, professional sized wide receiver. So I think the physical traits of this class really do stand out to me because their talent is obviously something you always want to recruit, but what you can't teach size. And it feels like even if these guys don't live up to their 5-star potential per se, they're still big, physical, professional, like almost NFL sized guys already. So at least you're plugging in guys who at least look the part and have the physical acumen. And then it doesn't feel like as much of a boomer bust situation. Like, even if they don't live up to their full potential, at least they're big guys. They're guys that can throw the other guys in the Big Ten around, and they can kind of impose their will a little bit physically, even if their skills don't develop the way people think they will.
One of the frustrations of last season, as you know well, as the USC fan base knows well, is that Zachariah Branch just wasn't able to really take off and lift his game to the next level. There's so much raw talent there. It just didn't happen. It just didn't click. And we've seen this in a number of USC skill position players. Also running backs as well. Just electric, natural talent. Like, you could get a glimpse of the potential, but didn't fully come together. As we contemplate Booby Feaster, are we looking at someone that we can feel pretty solid about in terms of actualizing potential? Obviously, nothing's guaranteed in this game, right? You just can't say it's an automatic slam dunk, but I think a lot of USC fans would certainly be interested in getting a sense of, all right, on a scale of Zachariah Branch to Jordan Addison, or or let's say Mario Williams, who was a bust, or Dorian Singer, who also was a bust, to on the other side, someone like Taj Washington, who really did maximize his potential on a scale of bust to superstar. Any early sense of like what a reasonable expectation looks like for Booby Feaster at USC?
Reasonable expectation is a tricky question. I think something that stands out to me is Booby Feaster is obviously bigger than Zachariah Branch, which again goes back to my earlier point. Zachariah Branch was very skilled, very fast, very exciting, made some of those exciting plays in the return game, his first couple of games in the 2023 season, but is just not big and just didn't seem to have the hands. He had so many drops, and that was the most frustrating thing about him, was he just couldn't hold on to the football at all. So I think with Booby Feaster, you're getting somebody who, again, he's at least bigger. He's not going to shrink next to some of these Big Ten defenders. He's not going to get popped by them and drop the ball and stuff like that. He's got a little bit more size on him, a couple extra pounds, a couple extra inches. And but he's still known for being very fast and very smooth and very dynamic. And I think I think reasonable expectation now. It's hard for me to predict for him just because he's so young. He's going to be 17 years old as a college freshman, so he's got a lot of years before he develops into hopefully what he ultimately turns into before he gets drafted. I think he's more of a candidate for a guy to spend 4 years instead of 3 years, unless he has a remarkable 3 years. It's possible that he goes and gets drafted to the NFL at 20 years old. It's possible, or 19 or whatever. But I think he is more of a candidate than someone like, say, Mark Bowman to stay an extra year. And I think by that point, you're looking at. If the ranking shows to be true, he'll be that superstar guy, that over 1,000-yard guy. I think the first couple of years, 2026, 2027, a comparison that pops into my mind is Brendan Rice, just because I think Brendan Rice in 2023 especially didn't have the, necessarily the consistent years, but he surely was still one of the more reliable USC wide receivers in a really down year for USC wide receivers. And he was a real big play home run hitter. When the rest of the offense was just looking like a shell of itself compared to the year before, he was still scoring a lot of touchdowns, even though he didn't have a ton of yards. I think he had like somewhere in the 600-yard range, but 11 touchdowns, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. So I'd assume, as he's a little bit more raw, he's still going to have the big play potential, and he's still big enough and established enough and, develop enough of a prospect that he's not going to disappear. So even I think his floor is like not floor, but his reasonable middle ground is someone like Brendan Rice, especially these first couple of years.
Well, given his youth, I think that's something to underscore here, that, that the first year might be a bit of a developmental year. And then the second year, after you've kind of soaked up knowledge and you've put on some pounds, you've grown in size a little bit, for a guy this young, that might be important to keep in mind, that right out of the gate, we might not see it all come together, but in year two, big leap, and then in a third year could be an all-timer at USC. But of course, we shall see. All right, Ethan, we're going to talk about Big Ten Media Days in just a second. And of course, next week's going to be our Big Ten Media Days preview. The actual event is July 22nd through 24th in Las Vegas. Big Ten Media Days in just a second here at the Voice of College Football. But first, in the chat, Manjeet Tour, thank you for the comment, Manjeet. What's up, fellas? If Riley is such a QB guru, why was he sold on Miller Moss? Didn't go get Howard from Kansas State? Interesting question. It's July. Like, why not? Why not take a crack at this one? Ethan, before I turn it over to you, I would just say, Manjeet, Ohio State, we saw in the playoff the dudes that Ohio State had at the other 10 positions on offense, especially wide receiver, also at running back. You know, that part of the reason Will Howard did work really well at Ohio State was just, you know, the level of talent was so high, consistently high surrounding him. And he had, you know, an elite defense, which was deep, which, you know, was able to withstand some injury hits that, you know, USC did not have the defensive depth that Ohio State had. So Will Howard, you put him on Ohio State, there was so much quality and depth and talent surrounding him. It was a really good fit for him. Would that same fit have existed at USC? You know, I don't think you know, and I was high on Will Howard. You know, I said back when this was a thing in December that not this past December, but December of 2023, that, you know, his Kansas State numbers were actually better than they might seem because he was often the backup quarterback. He was coming in to relieve other injured Kansas State quarterbacks. So what he did was under duress. It was thrust upon him. I liked Will Howard, but putting Will Howard into USC's situation, that was kind of the uncertainty for me. And you put Will Howard on Ohio State. You put any player comparable to Will Howard on Ohio State, like that was just a situation where a lot of, you know, not special quarterbacks, but just solid quarterbacks were in a position to succeed. So, in other words, Manjeet, I'm not sure we should be using Ohio State's success as kind of the way to relitigate the Will Howard question at USC. He had a situation that was really tailored for him. Like, you put Miller Moss into Ohio State, just for the sake of comparison, I don't think it's a dramatic difference in overall results. Let's keep in mind, Ohio State did go 10-2 with all that talent. So it's not as though Will Howard was a rock star during the regular season, but, you know, he with that full team, that full roster firing on all cylinders, Will Howard was in a really good situation. So Ethan, your turn at bat for the Lincoln Riley, Miller Moss, Will Howard, Ohio State question.
I just don't think it matters if Lincoln Riley wanted Will Howard, because I don't think there's any world where he comes here, to be completely honest with you. I think that, like you said, Ohio State was just so set up to be successful. I mean, in the preseason, everyone was just sure that they were going to waltz their way to a national title. You know, it was a little bit shaky after they lost a couple regular season games, especially with how dominant Oregon was in the regular season. But then they proved that they were the team everybody thought they were. If you're Will Howard, you're looking at these two schools, and Will Howard's a competitive guy. Everything I've seen from him, he's a guy who is all about chasing a national title. You know, nothing else really. I mean, other things matter to him, obviously, but not to the level of pursuing a national title. You're looking at USC, who, you know, is coming off an 8-5 shaky year. You're probably going to have to compete with Miller to even be the starter, because Lincoln's going to give Miller his fair shot because of how long Miller had been in the system, which is another point that I'll get to in a second. But you're probably going to have to compete with Miller to start for a team that regressed. And, you know, compared to a team where you step in and you're immediately national title favorites, it's just like, I'm sure Lincoln did want him to some extent. I don't think if Lincoln threw all the chips in the center of the table, I don't think you're getting him, especially not last year. Especially, you know, not with Chad Bowden without Chad Bowden in the building, without all the momentum that they've gotten in recruiting. I don't think there's any world where, even if Lincoln Riley wanted him more badly than any other player in the country, I don't think you're getting him last year. It just was too perfect of a situation for him to walk into at Ohio State. But yeah, secondly, I think everyone was high on Miller, myself included, after the Louisville game. And, you know, he hadn't really done anything to dissuade that. I also don't think Miller played all that horrible even when he was the starter until the last couple of games. I think that, you know, the leash that they had for him was pretty reasonable considering how he played. And I also think that Lincoln Riley liked him because Lincoln Riley's a human being and he appreciated the loyalty that Miller brought to the table. I mean, Miller, you have to remember, Miller and Jackson Dart were basically the same in the recruiting rankings when they came on the scene in 2021, I believe Dart was like one spot above Miller, but they were both like top 20 quarterbacks in the country. They were bona fide star, like 4 or 5 star quarterback talents. They were very, very good. So, and as soon as Caleb Williams is on the scene, Dart skips town because he's like, I know I can go start in SEC school. He did. He became a first-round draft pick, all that stuff. Miller sticks around and learns the system and, remains loyal, competes with Caleb, tries to compete with Caleb Williams in practice, even though he had no shot, learns under Caleb Williams, waited for his shot. So I think Lincoln Riley, just as anyone would, appreciated the loyalty, appreciated him waiting his turn, and was going to give him his shot if, Will Howard didn't, or another similar guy didn't fall into his lap. And let's also not pretend that Will Howard is some first-round quarterback talent. I mean, he was taken by the 6th round, and he's not going to start over like 43-year-old Aaron Rodgers. He's a good quarterback, but he's not Caleb Williams. So it's not like that kind of difference maker offensively. Like you said, he was walking into an incredible situation. So I just don't think there's any world in 2024 where Lincoln Riley wants him that bad. And I think even if he did, they're not getting him anyway.
Yeah, boy, I mean, like this is a topic where we could go down the rabbit hole. I would only say in closing, before we move on, that Jeff Brom at Louisville, who now is coaching Miller Moss, he coached Tyler Shuck, and Tyler Shuck, was surprisingly drafted, middle 2nd round, well before Shadur Sanders and Dylan Gabriel. It's going to be fascinating to see, how does Miller Moss work out in Jeff Brom's system. That's going to be such a point of intrigue at Louisville, and probably something that we'll devote at least a few minutes to in August. When we look at the 2025 season, we look at national storylines. Miller Moss at Louisville. That's going to be something we will hit on probably sometime next month, because it's not as though Missouri State is going to be a game that will have us on the edge of our seats here at USC. It's going to be basically a glorified scrimmage. So just to be interesting to see what happens with Miller Moss at Louisville. All right, Ethan, another item we were going to talk about on tonight's show, Big Ten Media Days. Tell us your thoughts about the Trojans who are going to be representing the program in Las Vegas, and that's a new thing. Big Ten Media Days in Vegas. Hello, West Coast. Like, that's bringing the 4 West Coast schools aboard. But anyway, your reaction and your insights into the contingent that USC is sending to Vegas.
Sure, Matt. Here's the headline here. Makai Lemon, Kamari Ramsey, and Elijah Page to represent USC at Big Ten Media Days. So I think my initial thoughts, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I think Kamari Ramsey's a no-brainer. I think he was a representative last year. He would have been, a 1st or 2nd round pick if he entered the NFL draft this year. Bona fide defensive star, loyal enough to the program to come back for another year. Makes perfect sense. It would be more of a surprise if he wasn't on here than if he was. I think Makai Lemon is another pretty obvious choice. I think he's, we pulled up the Pro Football Focus a couple weeks ago, last time I was on the show, where Pro Football Focus had him as the number 1 wide receiver going into 2025 there. And then ESPN had Jacoby Lane on one list, and we kind of, broke that down. But, he's obviously a star. Got the 90 overall in College Football 26. All the things seem to be in place for him. People are predicting him to have a big breakout season. He's also just, the most established, consistent wide receiver. We talked about the big play potential and the red zone target that Jacoby Lane is. He flashed even more exciting kind of crazy little runs there at the end of the season than Makai Lemon did. But in terms of whole body of work, Makai Lemon obviously did a little bit more. He also did some in the return game. So again, this is just a guy who is your most established offensive star, has been with the program. Again, makes sense. Elijah Page is the surprising one. He's, to me, you're not sending Jaden Mayava, which is interesting. You're not sending one of the running backs or maybe, another defensive guy, especially last year after how strong the defense was. Instead, you're sending this offensive tackle who hasn't always been the most beloved USC guy. He had his struggles, especially early in the season last year, but then really turned it around towards the end. There are a lot of people who wrote him off those first couple of weeks, but he really turned it around. But I think, sending him is really an indication on how the program feels about him. I think, you don't want to send a guy to Big Ten. I mean, you're kind of trying to send the best of the best to Big Ten media days, I would think, right? 2-3 of your top guys on your team who you want representing the program. So I think that indicates to me that the coaching staff feels that he's taken even another step forward in his development this year, and which is great news. He's obviously a big guy, obviously was a very talented high school player, and showed flashes. Pat McAfee was a guy who featured him on a show for a little segment at one point and thought that he was a guy who had a lot of size, who could potentially be pretty dangerous on the offensive line. But I think this is real sign that he's developed. But I'm curious what your take is on this, Matt.
Yeah, Elijah Page is clearly the story here. Mekhi Lemon and Kamari Ramsey are going to be big dogs, the kinds of players that a school generally should invite to media days. And you mentioned Jaden Maiava not here. Miller Moss was at Big Ten media days 1 year ago, so I think that's so. First off, Maiava not being there, I think that's a good decision. I think it's managing expectations. Because that if Jaden Maiava was at Big Ten media days, he'd just be asked, "Are you ready? Are you good enough? Are you, have you learned the offense?" And that kind of thing might get pretty old pretty quickly for someone who is entering a prove-it season. So I like the decision not to have Maiava there. I think just let him just study and in quiet. Behind the scenes, keep a lower profile. I think that works. And then the other thing, so Elijah Page going there, that's also notable. And one of the things I always talk about in terms of coaching and coaching decisions, and obviously we'll be diving into this when the college football season gets rolling for real in late August. But even right now, we can say this. Okay, Lincoln Riley made a very conscious choice to have Elijah Page at media days. Sometimes coaching decisions are all about just the strategy. Like, we need you to perform this role. We need you to be in this position, come through for us, deliver for us. But another aspect of coaching decisions, and every year, this cannot be emphasized enough, because it's just one of the subtle nuances of coaching and of managing a roster and managing individuals. A lot of the time, coaching decisions are not so much about tactics themselves. It's about sending a message to the player. It's about creating a context for motivation. So knowing that Elijah Page struggled early last season, but then improved as the year went on, that he went through growing pains. We remember how awful he was against Michigan. He got bullied. He was rattled. Like, we can just all say it. Like, that's just was the reality of the situation. After he struggled in that first big road game against Michigan, had some uncomfortable moments, he could have wilted and he could have complained. No, he kept his head down. He worked hard. He got better. He improved. And so I think that having him at Big Ten media days is a statement of saying, hey, like, we trust your improvement, and now you need to bring it for a whole season. Now you need to be our best from game 1 through game 12. And so I think there's a very clear, conscious message being sent by Lincoln Riley to Elijah Page. Be our big dog up front. And also, if you are elite, Elijah Page, then our offensive line, which, you ask me, and people who know me and people who have followed this show with me on it, whether it's with you now, Ethan, or with Tim Prangley last year, everyone knows offensive line is the is the nerve center. It's the X factor. It is the hinge point, whatever you want to call it. If the offensive line can be elite, this team can be elite. It all goes to the offensive line. So having an offensive lineman in the group, it's a statement of urgency, but it's also kind of a way of saying, hey, Elijah Page, be our big dog. Lead us, guide us, make life easier for Jaden Maiava, make life easier for this running game, make the pieces of the puzzle fit. So I think it's a really intriguing, and I would also say good decision. And now it's just up to Elijah Page to justify the level of trust Lincoln Riley and the coaching staff are placing in him.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also something that I've talked about before that I'll bring up here again is just confidence. I've been begging Lincoln Riley all offseason to just instill confidence in Maiava. And I think this is another instance where he's instilling confidence in someone like Elijah Page. Like, he's sending Elijah Page with Kamari Ramsey and Mekhi Lemon, two more established stars, and he's like, look, we see you. The message it sends is, look, we see you on the same level as these guys. And that can go a long way for a player's confidence. I think that a big part of coaching, like you said, is you talked about coaching. I'm going to talk about coaching a little bit too. I think a big part of it is instilling confidence in some of your less confident players, especially the players who have a lot of potential, and their worst moments come when they're nervous and they don't believe in themselves. Their best moments come when they do. And I think that, Maiava is obviously someone who's like that a lot, but I think that Elijah Page probably too. I'm sure that, part of the reason why Michigan was such a bad game for him was he was really, in the big house, quite literally, with the big boys now in, 120,000 fans and, just screaming in his face, and those big, NFL level Michigan defensive linemen, running down his throat. And that's like, Elijah Page has the size and, the development to compete with those players. He just, sometimes you don't believe that you do because you've never done it before. You have to actually go out and see yourself do it before you get some of that confidence. But I think that confidence can also be built by the coaches telling you that you can do it. And that's, I think, probably part of this too, is Lincoln Riley saying, hey, we believe in you as one of our stars. We really want you to be here, and we believe that you can do it, and we wouldn't be sending you if we didn't. So we're going to send you. And yeah, now it's on Elijah Page, obviously, to do the work to back up that choice.
All right, more to come on the USC Trojans Primetime Live show here at the Voice of College Football. But first, take a 1-minute break for a word from our sponsor. On the other side, we're going to talk about Elijah Newby and then one of USC's opponents in the coming Big Ten season. So here's a word from our sponsor here at the Voice of College Football.
You can make a difference here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link. Financially contribute to the Voice of College Football without spending a penny. Same shopping experience. It's easy. Go to any video on any channel. Go to the description section and grab the link right next to the capital letters that say Amazon. Use that link, and Amazon will instantaneously convert to your account, settings, history, everything intact, just like whatever link you use right now. No difference. Pay no attention to the product that you see right there. Just go search what you want. Don't forget the Amazon link. Thank you for your support. Sincerely, the Voice of College Football.
And a reminder that Mark Rogers' national program, the College Football Show, airs every weekday, Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. in the West, for USC fans, here at the Voice of College Football. So catch Mark's national show and any other team shows. There are plenty of them, and a few of them have made some debuts in recent weeks, some new teams growing, becoming part of our family. And so especially for the Big Ten schools, like you want to get a scouting report, check out the shows at the Voice of College Football. For example, there's an Illinois show, Illinois Fighting Illini Live. Just drop in on that show. Be sure to throw in the like and a subscription, but also just get the inside intel on Illinois and some of USC's other Big Ten opponents this season here at the Voice of College Football. All right, Ethan. So other news for USC football from the past week. I saw an item about Elijah Newby being moved from linebacker to defensive end. He talked about it. It's part of our coverage at Trojans Wire. So, Ethan, your reaction to this particular positional move and what you think it means for the defense, what you think it means for Danton Lynn's plan, and how the various pieces of the puzzle are going to fit on this defense in 2025.
Yeah, I think it's exciting for Elijah Newby. I think that he's, he obviously has the size to play edge rusher. He's 6'3", has the sub 11 second speed, and at that size, that's obviously really impressive. And it's just kind of interesting, I think, how the defensive line is shaped up, because essentially you've got a lot of transfers and new guys on the interior, like Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky. And then on the outside, you've got a lot of guys who are young and were around but showed a lot of potential last year. And that's like Braylon Shelby, Cameron Fountain, Anthony Lucas. They also added Jakeem Stewart, obviously. So it's interesting for them to kind of throw him in there, because he feels like another guy who's been around a bit, and it feels like he profiles kind of similarly to the other guys that they already have there. I know Sean Nua is really high on him. I've seen some quotes from Sean Nua, who was really just happy that Elijah Newby was so willing to move positions, and is also just really high on his size, and was really happy to have him in that room, especially with Anthony Lucas missing a lot of spring ball. So I think, it goes to show his unselfishness. It goes to show that, he's willing to play wherever the coaches think that he's the best fit to win football games. And I don't know, it's exciting. I think the more, I think, like I said, he fits into that category of Braylon Shelby, of Cameron Fountain, of even Anthony Lucas a little bit. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, none of those guys are established superstars, but all of them have shown a lot of flashes. So you would think the more of these guys that you have on the edge, the more likely it is that at least one of them develops into, a defensive superstar. So, and I think that all of them competing with one another too, and bringing that youthful energy and all that speed, and, just all that competitiveness into the room is always good for a unit as well. So overall, it's a nice move. I think the only thing that's a little bit worrying is USC doesn't exactly have the deepest linebacker room ever. And, that's getting a lot better next season. Talanoa Ely is obviously an established, recruit that they're getting. He's a 4-star. He's going to be great. And, they'll take off from there too. They're obviously praying that Eric Gentry doesn't get hurt again, all that stuff. But I think that's maybe the only downside here is it feels like they didn't have a lot of linebackers in the first place. So moving another one off is like, oh, they really don't have a lot of linebackers. But I think they're really going all in on defensive line. I think that that's a unit that they're really trying to shore up this year, because they went out and got so many recruits, and winning the trenches is obviously really important in the Big Ten. So they have reason to do so for sure. So I think this just kind of shows some of that emphasis. I think they're really trying to pound home, we're going to have a good defensive line this year, and we're going to throw all of our resources at it. It's obviously going to get more well-rounded next year with recruits coming in all aspects of, the secondary and the linebackers and the line. But this year they have their best recruits on the line. Their best and biggest transfers are on the line, it feels like. And then, they're moving a former 4-star recruit also from linebacker to the line. So they're going to have a good defensive line if it kills them, it feels like.
I think my main reaction to this is, USC doesn't run a traditional 4-3. And so is this move as simple as, USC not having a traditional 4-3, and that if USC did have a 4-3, would we be seeing this move? Does it come down to that particular point, or do you think there's something else at work here in terms of why this adjustment's being made?
I mean, I think if they run a traditional 4-3, I think this still happens. I mean, I think it's enough of a difference, even if you're kind of an outside linebacker who's rushing the quarterback a lot versus a defensive lineman. Like the footwork is different enough. Just the way that you attack your everyday routine is different enough. I think that it seems like that they, are really going all in on him switching positions and becoming a defensive lineman. So yeah, I think this happens regardless, but I mean, it's an interesting point. I don't know for sure. I'd be curious to see, certainly, but I do think I think personally it happens regardless from my point of view.
Okay, well, so here's the other follow-up, and that is, do you think this decision's going to stick? In other words, do you think that, this is going to be a situation where, all right, we think that we can get some value from putting Elijah Newby at defensive end. Let's see if he can be, an explosive rock star kind of edge rusher, and we give him, maybe a month into the season. And of course, let's remember here, Missouri State, Georgia Southern, Purdue, very soft on-ramp for the season. And these first few games are the kinds of games in which a coaching staff can tinker, a coaching staff can experiment, a coaching staff can put a lot of guys in a lot of different places. We look at these first 3 games and then reassess going into Michigan State, and then especially that really important Illinois game that everyone in the chat is talking about tonight and has been talking about really for the past few months. So do you think that, we shouldn't assign too much weight or meaning to this move, and that what's not important is where Elijah Newby is going to be in week 1 against Missouri State? It's where he's going to be in week 5 against Illinois. What's your sense of that?
I think it's in Elijah Newby's best interest to really kind of sell out on being a good edge rusher, only because I think this year, if I'm a kind of a USC football player with any semblance of a window into getting some playing time this year, who's young, especially like a lot of these edge rushers are, like Elijah Newby is, I think I'm like, this year is crucial only because of just the absolutely ridiculous load of defensive talent that's coming in next year in the 2026 recruiting class. And, a lot of those guys are going to show potential and be trying to win over the coaching staff as well. It's going to be very, very competitive at a lot of these positions. I think you want to have a leg up on some of those guys if you want to keep your spot. And so I think, it's not really in Elijah Newby's best interest to keep bouncing around positions and trying to figure out where he fits and not becoming a star edge rusher or a star linebacker, and just being kind of able to do both, but nobody really knows what his position is yet, because then, plug in Tawanoa Ely, plug in Luke Wafel, and your position is gone, right? Like, if those guys are able to contribute at the level that people think that they will their first year, because they're already, Big Ten sized players, they just have to, get used to the game and the skill at that level. There's no size that Coach Tremaine Carroll and the strength staff needs to put on them. They're already plenty big, and they're only going to get bigger and stronger and more agile. And Coach Carroll's role is still very important with them. But I just think, yeah, you don't really want to be messing around. I think, you want to hit the ground running week 1 on the position that you're playing, and you really want to stay there. So, I think at least from his point of view, sticking at edge rusher is within his best interest. I mean, the coaching staff is going to do whatever it takes to win. So if they, midway through the season think that him playing linebacker is better, again, if you have some injuries and you're really desperate for bodies, he's probably, a place that you would go. But I think, and he's the kind of player that I think, will develop and has a lot of that natural skill and a lot of that size. So I see him sticking, and I'd see that because I think he knows and everybody else knows that if he's going to have a consistent rotational spot in this defense come next year when all these big guys come in, he needs to have a big year this year, and he needs to sell out on really being an edge rusher starting now.
All right. One thing you said really kind of piqued my curiosity and led to a follow-up question. You mentioned Tremaine Carroll, the strength coach. Coach Carroll at USC, but just in a different form. Compared to what we're used to. So the fact that USC brought aboard a new strength coach after spring practice, right? Not a lot of time to, fully implement a system. You can begin to introduce some principles, but we all agree Tremaine Carroll is here so that his methods, his system is fully in place for that Rockstar 2026 recruiting class. And 2025 is kind of a transitional year for Tremaine Carroll. So with that having been said, should we just be prepared this season on defense for a lot of changes, switches, the coaches, saying, well, let's see if this works, and let's see if you go over there. Are we going to see the coaching staff really try to play around with combinations and personnel groupings, or are we going to see this coaching staff aim for really what you were talking about with Elijah Newby? Consistency, not bouncing around positions. One could make the argument that Tremaine Carroll and his late addition to the coaching staff for this season, that might create short-term instability in the service of long-term stability, better fit, better idea, better plan, more clarity long-term for the personnel on hand. But yet in the short term, that instability might cut against the 2025 team's interest when you have players, being shuttled around. How do you think that particular piece of this is going to kind of unfold with Tremaine Carroll, working with this 2025 team, but knowing he was hired for 2026 and beyond? That's a delicate balance that USC has to strike this season.
I think that you could see some instability, but I think it's a little bit different than the kind of instability you were describing, because you were describing, talented players getting moved around positions. I don't think you're going to see that. I think you could see some. I think the USC roster is deeper than that. I don't think it's not like we're at like Iowa or, Kansas State or, where Tremaine Carroll formerly was, or someplace in the middle of the country where, you get a 5-star guy and he's maybe not fitting at his position. You're going to move him positions because, you have a 5-star guy in Manhattan, Kansas. He's going to play somewhere. So I think the USC roster is deeper than that. There's still a lot of guys who came out of high school with 4- and 5-star talent. There's guys at almost every position this year. This year, I feel like compared to previous years, there aren't as many positions who have a clear number one guy, but there are a lot of positions who have 2 or 3 guys who I could see becoming a clear number one guy. Running back is one. All over the defensive line is another. The secondary has kind of some of that. Who's going to emerge as the number 3 wide receiver is another area. All of that kind of stuff. I think you have enough of a wealth of riches that, you're not going to move a guy positions, but you may see some of the switching out of let's give this young guy a shot. Let's give this young guy a shot, especially if the season kind of, derails early. They're not competing for the national championship anymore. They have 3+ losses before, some of these final games. You'll see more of that. You see more of that every year, regardless, of what the next year's recruiting class looks like or whatever. That always happens. If it means less, you get some of the younger guys in more, so you can, kind of turn your focus to the next year. But I do think if you see any instability, that's where it's going to be, is just in the name of competition. And it won't be this 5-star moves from edge rusher to outside linebacker, back to edge rusher to middle linebacker, back to edge rusher. It'll be more of Braylon Shelby starts and Braylon Shelby and Cameron Fountain start. Maybe Elijah Newby gets a start. And then, maybe you go back to Braylon Shelby based on matchups or based on whoever's performing well in practice or whatever. I still hope it's not that way. I mean, to build that trust, to build that consistency, to build that system, you want the same guys starting every week. It's something that you see a lot in baseball. Baseball, has had this kind of analytics versus traditionalism thing going on for the past couple of years, where the analytics say you should swap out guys more, but conventional baseball wisdom says obviously you keep guys in and you let most of them play every day, because even though they're going to put up a stinker here and there. Believing in them means that in the clutch moments they'll perform. They'll still have an overall breadth of a better season than if you platoon guys and, kind of try to get the best of both worlds. And so I think always consistency and security is better. But I do think that is the possible instability and it's justifiable in the sense that this year is important, but next year is obviously even more important. And like with Elijah Newby, you really want to figure out who your guys are that are solid, who do have a leg up on that recruiting class so that, you have some stability going in, where you're plugging guys in and, which guys need to develop and all those things.
All right, winding down the show, final segment, we want to talk about at least one USC Big Ten opponent on each of these summer shows as we lead up to the start of the new season. And tonight's opponent is Nebraska. And so, Ethan, one obvious note about this game, and for every game on a schedule, the timing, right? You look at college football history and the larger trajectory of the sport and its tally of national championships and the legacy of coaches would be different if certain matchups were played at different times in the season compared to what they actually were. The classic example, Miami, Florida State. That game was usually played early. Florida State was usually the best team in the country, playing the best ball in the 1980s, in the 1990s under Bobby Bowden at the end. At Thanksgiving, Florida State was the juggernaut, but the Miami game was usually early in the season, and the Hurricanes were the better team in those early season matchups. So USC, Nebraska, that's in early November. So it's a couple months down the line. It's a little bit later in the season. So teams will have been developed a little bit more, can knock off that early season rust and uncertainty. So I ask you, Ethan, better for USC or better for Nebraska that this game is in early November as opposed to being a mid-September or maybe early October game?
I think just generally this feels like a situation that's better for Nebraska. Just all of the circumstances of the game. Obviously, home field advantage plays into this. I think Nebraska just feels like a program that is so desperate to win that they honestly have less to lose. Like they were obviously once a very, very good program, a national championship winning program, but they've just been so bad for so long and have had no hope for so long. Like, it's not like they had a year where they went to the Rose Bowl and beat Penn State, and a year where they got a Heisman winning quarterback and were, a game and a Caleb Williams injury away from, being in the college football playoff. Like, they've been bad. They haven't made bowl games. Last year, just squeaking into a bowl game was like Nebraska fans everywhere celebrated. I know because I'm related to a lot of them, but I just think they're at home. They're going to have 80,000 strong. Like you said, it's November, so it's going to be a little bit colder than if it was in September. USC hasn't done well in Big Ten road games at all. They haven't won one yet. They've only won the neutral, I don't count UCLA because they've been playing that game in the Pac-12 for decades and decades and decades. So, a true Big Ten road game they have not won. So I just think even if Nebraska's season is completely off the rails, they're not the team where that morale is really going to snowball them. Like I said, they're gonna have their fans in. Beating USC still means something to them. They lost to us last year, so they're going to be looking for revenge. I think USC also, it's the clearest spot on the schedule where they could be coming off a rough patch. Coming off of the Notre Dame game, which is the opponent that was the best team last year, all things considered. Oregon was also very good. They come up a couple weeks after that, but Notre Dame was in the national championship in the national championship finals and ended up being the runner-up there. So I just think, and especially USC just has struggled so much against Notre Dame in recent years. And that being a rivalry game, if it's a loss, it's really demoralizing. And they also play Michigan even before that. It's USC has struggled so much the past couple of years with really backsliding when things start to go bad. They've had a lot of early season winning streaks, and then they hit a game where, things go poorly and then they really backslide. So I just think that USC is going to have a lot more pressure on it regardless of how their season's going. If it's going bad compared to that point, people are going to be panicking about the backslide happening again. If it's good, it's a potential trap game. Nebraska is just a program that if they're great, they still can lose that game. If they come into that game with a significant winning record, they've won 5 or 6 games already, they can lose that game and nobody in Lincoln's going to panic. And they, if they're having a losing season, they're going to play with that nothing to lose mentality because, it's just another losing season in Lincoln. So I just don't see Nebraska being in any kind of position unless they're undefeated and the number 1 team in the country, which is not going to be them. But, on the crazy chance that it is, I just don't see any situation where there's more pressure on Nebraska than on USC.
All right. The other big question for the USC-Nebraska game, and of course, when we get into the heart of the season, we get into late October and game week, we'll be able to dive into this matchup on a deeper level. But, a couple months out here in July, the other obvious question we have to ask and explore, Ethan, is Dylan Raiola, right? That, so much fanfare, so much hype, and he's, the son of a famous Nebraska Cornhusker player, and it just didn't come together. But he gets Dana Holgorsen, and it's really interesting that USC-Nebraska game last season, it was Jaden Maiava's USC debut as a starter, but also Dana Holgorsen was on that Nebraska sideline for that game. So these teams and the principal players, the principal figures in the game, they were beginning to learn how to do their jobs against each other. And so that's going to inform this upcoming matchup. But, so Dana Holgorsen wasn't a great head coach at West Virginia, had his moments, but he sure knows his way around a chalkboard on offense. And so, he's being looked to as the guy who's going to make everything work for Dylan Raiola. But, sometimes, you can have all the coaching you want. Player still has to do it. So is Dylan Raiola, do you think, going to be that player who rises to the challenge? And, assuming he does, that makes that USC game even tougher for the Trojans this coming season.
I think Dylan Raiola is an exciting player. I've watched more Dylan Raiola probably than most USC fans, just because, like I mentioned, I have some uncles who are Nebraska fans. So, I was around some of the Nebraska games that were on. I remember specifically the Illinois-Nebraska game, which turned out to be Nebraska's first loss early in the season, but was really close and could have gone either way, to be honest with you. And he's an exciting player. I mean, he is not just a guy who was hyped up out of high school and then came into college and, threw up a goose egg. He made some exciting plays. He played well. He showed flashes. He was obviously raw. The Nebraska offense is obviously starting from the bottom. They're really, it's very famous how bad the Nebraska program has been, how they got worse under Scott Frost, all that. They're really just, Matt Rule is really just having to build it from the ground up here. That's why last season was considered a success, even though they barely made a bowl game. So I think he will develop. I think he will be exciting. I think he'll be a top draft prospect. How productive he'll be in college remains to be seen. I think he's going to be a top draft prospect regardless, just because of his physical traits, because of his natural talent. I mean, we've seen in recent years, guys like Trey Lance and Anthony Richardson and stuff go so early by really not accomplishing much in college at all. Obviously to varying degrees of success in the NFL. So maybe the culture is going to change there a little bit. But I just think that he's got the talent. He's going to continue to be a hyped up guy. They really prioritized getting some transfers in the room on offense. I think a lot of their projected top wide receivers are all transfers, including Zane Key out of Kentucky, who's supposed to be their number 1 wide receiver this year. So, with the kind of resources and the kind of momentum that Nebraska has, which is admittedly not a lot, they're not going to get Booby Feaster to go out to Nebraska. They're not going to get Jeremiah Smith to transfer to Nebraska. It's not 1990. It's not 1980. But they're still investing a lot in Raiola. They're trying to build around him. And he did show flashes. I think he has what it takes. And Matt Rule is, I think, a good college coach. I mean, he is a guy that Nebraska fans like a lot. He really turned that program around. Obviously, his NFL tenure didn't go so well, but that happens a lot with good college coaches. They go to the NFL and it doesn't work out so well. So I don't think that that's any indictment on his ability as a college coach. So yeah, I think he's going to be good. Will he be good enough to kind of carry Nebraska to a win this year against USC? I don't know. I don't think so. But I do think he is a guy who will be a top 2 or 3 quarterback in the conference eventually. And he's a guy who teams are already, trying to do their homework on, because he's a force to be reckoned with, and he can make those big plays.
Well, I mean, you made headlines with that one. Now we should ship this off to the Nebraska fans. If he's a top 3 quarterback in the Big Ten,
not now, eventually.
Well, I mean, so this year, or we're talking like just a longer developmental arc, and maybe next year he'll get to that point.
I could see him being in that conversation, middle to end of next year.
So not this
year, no.
Okay, just wanted some clarity on that, because that was an eyebrow raiser. And when I say eyebrow raiser, the implication is not that you're wrong, but just like, whoa, how far are you taking that? So just you immediately applied some guardrails there.
Yeah.
And I think appropriately so. Always well-calibrated analysis from Ethan Inman here at the Voice of College Football. Just a final note, Jeff Rodriguez says they lost their defensive coordinator, so let's just hit on that point. Tony White, very, very highly regarded defensive coordinator. He goes off to Florida State. So Nebraska promotes John Butler from within. So an internal promotion, kind of like what Lincoln Riley did with his offensive line coach, Zach Hansen, replacing Josh Henson. Ethan, any sense of the significance of Tony White, Nebraska losing Tony White? Can John Butler be everything that Tony White was, or do you think that there's a real loss of quality and value for Nebraska there, which would really help USC in this year's matchup?
I think, again, this is kind of another, tale in the story of Nebraska just doesn't have the kind of momentum to go to keep guys. I mean, Tony White going from a team that, wasn't great but made a bowl game to a 2-10 team is like sad. Obviously, Florida State is coming off the, barely missing the college football playoff because of Jordan Travis's injury 2 years ago. And, this past year was just like a total surprise how bad they were as a football team. And they'll probably rebound decently well based on, the recruits that they've gotten in and the way that team is shaping up. I've kept a decently close eye on them, and I think they'll be all right. And they obviously still have the kind of flashiness of being Florida State and the resources and the money. And Mike Norvell is still a well-regarded football coach and all that stuff. But that's like, I don't know, kind of sad if you're a Nebraska fan, I think, to a guy leaves your team that has some upward momentum and made a bowl game for a 2-10 team, regardless of the optics of how the years past had gone and all that stuff. But I think, Matt Rule is a good, kind of leader for the defensive staff. It has been my kind of take on him so far in his Nebraska role. I think that his promotion of a guy internally says, again, a little bit about Nebraska's resources, but also a little bit about, him being confident in how he's working with his staff and, kind of the system that he's put in place there as the guy at the top as well. Nebraska's defense has been vastly improved compared to the Scott Frost era and the Matt Rule era. That's no secret. So I think they'll be all right. I don't think you're going to see a, drastic drop off compared to last year. Are they going to improve majorly? Again, I'm not sold on that either. But I don't think it's the kind of thing where it's like, oh yes, USC should be licking their lips because Nebraska's defense is going to be one of the worst in college football. I think they'll be fine.
All right, folks. So in 2 weeks, July 22nd through 24th, we have Big Ten Media Days. So next week, we kind of preview Big Ten Media Days. So that means, we're going to obviously be offering USC content, but we'll also be looking at kind of like the state of play in the Big Ten, storylines in the Big Ten to preview the Big Ten Media Days that are 2 weeks out. So we hope you're enjoying your summer. We know that, preseason camp just inching closer. We're just getting closer to real news, not just talking, not just speculating. We're all getting a little bit excited. Of course, day one of the college football season, August 23rd. So if you do the quick math, that's less than a month and a half away. It's almost here, folks. It's almost here. So next week, we preview Big Ten Football Media Days for Ethan Inman. I'm Matt Zemek. Be sure to like our show on YouTube, subscribe, get the notification reminder, and also to do the same for the other family of shows here at the Voice of College Football. We will see you next week. Thanks so much.